check my microphone's working. Fantastic. Well, thank you, Emma. I'm really, really excited to be here. I usually get to speak at Dude Bro Tech conferences, so this is incredibly refreshing. Quick hand raising, if people feel comfortable with this. I just want to know, who does development-y, programmy stuff in here? Cool. Who's kind of a newbie? Hey! And who's a more advanced person? Yeah, probably more of you than put your hands up, you just won't admit it. Right. Don't want to be popping. Right. So, I'm going to talk to you about accessibility. So, I go to visit the website of a car dealership, and I can't see it. The website loaded just fine, but I need a screen reader to help me access the site. So this is what I get. Let's see if this picks up.
Invite masters, new and used car dealers, Ford, Honda, Volvo, Jeep, Opel, Nissan dealership London, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, York, Sheffield, Liverpool, Chester.
So that's just the title of the page, the title of the website, because it's been crammed with so many keywords for SEO. So what happens when we read the beginning of the page itself?
Web content, banner. Banner. Link image. Logo underscore Ford. Link image. Link underscore VT underscore K underscore R03. Link image. Logo underscore Honda. Link image. Logo underscore car. Visited. Link image. Logo underscore header underscore 2JPG. Link. Models equals Opel. Link image. Jeep logo PNG. Link. Models equals Opel. Link. Models equals Volvo.
So in case you couldn't tell, that's actually navigation. But because they've used images all the way through, without any alternative text, it's very difficult to tell what it is when it's just read through text. So what if you can see a page, but you can't necessarily hear it? So you go to play a video, but you can't actually tell what's going on in that video, because you can't hear it. It's pretty much impossible to understand. It looks kind of cute. Yep, still don't understand what's going on. What? No idea. So now you're reading a page on a website. You decided you want to contact the people who wrote the site. So you go to click on the contact link in the navigation. But the hit area on that link is so tiny, the space that you actually have to click on it is actually really difficult, especially if you have difficulty using a mouse, being very accurate with a mouse. It makes it even harder to try to click that link, because you really have to make sure you click the text. So you go to a contact page, and there's a form with 3 fields. And maybe you're a bit new to the web. And so you understand that I know how to fill out a form. I've done forms in paper. But there's this little symbol. This is quite light on this screen. What's that? Is that like some kind of rune, magical symbol? What does that actually mean? Because actually, if you've not used a web form before, you might not know that the common thing that people use asterisks for is to say this is a required field. So first we couldn't see the page, then we couldn't hear it, then we found the page hard to interact with, and then we found it hard to understand. And these are all ways that a site can be inaccessible to people. Because web accessibility is making a site available to everyone, regardless of their needs. And there's a reason this is important. It's because as people building technology, we are making the new everyday things. We're making the things that people use all the time. They use the things that we build more than people use roads, more than they go to the supermarket. We're building things to house photos. We're building things that are supermarkets online, things that people use to socialize, things that people use to shop. The problem is that we often build things for people who are just like us, whoever we are. It's always easier to create products for people just like us because we understand the needs that those people have. That's why a lot of the very successful products in technology are built by people scratching their own itch or eating their own dog food. And so I have to, unfortunately, quickly say the D word in here. We all know that our industry isn't very diverse. But even outside of gender diversity, there are other areas of diversity that are very much affected. Things like we lack diverse ages, we lack diverse backgrounds, we lack diverse educational and financial statuses, we lack diverse abilities too. Because we don't all have the same needs. And so we end up creating products for people just like us, whoever we are and whatever our needs are. We forget that other people have requirements that differ from our own, or even maybe conflict with our own needs. We need to understand and care about those people's differing needs in order to be able to create more useful and more usable products. And the way we do this is by spending meaningful time with other people who have needs that are different from our own. And that helps us develop a greater understanding of those needs, because the greater capacity a team has for understanding the audience, the more likely they are to solve the problems that that audience has. And a big part of that is not othering people. Because when you actually have a diverse team working on products, you're incorporating and including everyone rather than designing and assuming you know best for somebody else. This is something that we often hear when people refer to stupid users or stupid clients who don't know what they're doing. It's very easy to be dismissive of the people using our products if we think of it in an us versus them terms. And so it's really important not to think of diversity and accessibility as being about other. One of the common things we have when I talk about web accessibility, people who already know about making websites more accessible will generally think about screen readers. So the thing that you heard earlier, reading out that navigation, that's assistive technology that will read the contents of a page to someone. Often to people who can't see the content, so often to people who are blind, but not always. And web accessibility isn't just about those screen readers. I think a lot of people, they think that their page is accessible as long as they've made it available to screen readers. But we're designing for a much wider audience, an audience whose needs will include accessibility, but are actually much wider than that. And that's why universal design and inclusive design are nice terms to use rather than accessibility, because we're putting on the focus on designing for everyone, as wide a group as possible, rather than just focusing specifically on the needs of people, particularly with disabilities. And that's also why I reckon we should avoid using the term user in favour of just person. Because it's far easier to respect someone if you call them human or person and you're thinking of them as someone who is just like you, rather than othering them with a term like user. And so I like to say experience design, not user experience design. And language in this area is incredibly important because it's how we communicate these issues, and how we communicate the issues is how we start to act upon them. And above everything else, we need to build meaningful products that serve people's needs and value their time. And we've got to be cautious in assuming that we know what's best for people, particularly people with disabilities. Because it's very common that people will have an idea of what someone with a disability will need when they don't actually know, they haven't spoken to that person themselves. If we believe what's best for other people who have differing needs, we can be a bit patronising and often just wrong. This is sometimes referred to as being colonial design. So often when people are introduced to the idea of screen readers, they'll start going, oh, well, someone can see the text on the page. Well, how about if I hide instructions just for screen readers inside the page, so that only people with screen readers can see those extra instructions so they can benefit from it? But actually, people using screen readers use websites all the time. They don't need any extra instructions. All you're doing is like hammering them with much more additional noise rather than letting them get to the content that they know what they're looking for, and they do know how to get there, as long as you're not putting other stuff in their way. So we need to design for purpose. We need to have focus in order to design in a way that's actually useful to people. And this starts with content, because unless the content itself is accessible, nothing's accessible. And first off, we have to, of course, consider our audience. Often that means considering needs of people who aren't in your audience. Because if you're like, well, I've spoken to my audience and they don't have any accessibility needs, but But that's maybe because your audience is limited to that in the first place, because you haven't previously considered making your content more accessible. So you need to consider your audience again, not limit yourself. So what makes inclusive design, web accessibility? There are 4 broad parameters we need to consider when we're doing this. Make it easy to see, make it easy to hear, make it easy to interact, and make it easy to understand. And one of the easiest ways we can do this is by providing alternatives to the content that we already have. Because often we'll have one format of content, and that format is not accessible to everyone. And so just creating an alternative format will make it much easier for people to. So this is an example I've got from actually when I made my book. And I've got the screenshot of the ebook on the left side, and on the right side is what the ebook looks like on one of the e-readers. The whole point of the images at the top is that you can look at the different colours, and you can see how things might appear to people with different forms of colour blindness. So that's how that might vary slightly. Of course, looking at it on an e-reader, which is rendered entirely in grayscale, can't tell the difference between the images at all. And I mean, it's kind of explained in the surrounding text, but it's not explained in the caption. I didn't think about that at all. I didn't consider the accessibility of what I was building. One of the nice things I've seen is for when people have video. It's really nice to be able to produce an alternative form of content to that video for people who can't see it. And this is a really fun example I found. It's a bit light on this screen. This is a really lovely transcript of this video on freelance TV. You might already be planning kind of content in this inclusive way, just because a lot of the things that we think about when we're trying to be inclusive are also just common sense usability goals anyway. So here's a few more kind of starters for it. Use plain language. That can benefit everybody, from people with dyslexia and other cognitive difficulties to, as a lot of people in here will understand, non-native speakers. If the website you're visiting is not in the same language as you natively speak, the simpler the language, the easier it is to understand. This is a nice example, I think, of the gov.uk, the Government Digital Service in the UK. They write sentences that are short and easy to understand. This makes the text less intimidating. It makes it easier to skim from one thing to the next. The audience of your content might dictate how complicated your language is. You might be writing content for experts. But still, if you avoid the jargon and really complicated words, that way you can make things much more accessible to people who are new to the industry as well. Acronyms. You know, the thing where you have 3 letters for marking sort of the beginnings of each word. Explain their meanings the first time you use them. So here's a nice example I found. A friend of mine put an excerpt of his book on SitePoint. So he's talking about SAS, and in the middle he talks about the command line interface, the CLI. For the longest amount of time, I didn't know what a CLI was, because no one had actually put that in a thing. I hadn't bothered looking up, to be fair, but I was just like, oh, it's just something I don't know about. Don't know what it is. And every subsequent time that he talks about CLIs, he just puts CLI, because he knows that the first time people read it, now they know what it is. And that's important, because there are other things that CLI stands for as well. And a few things I looked up, a customer loyalty index and a cultural landscape inventory. It's just 2 other things, but very, very different things from a command line interface. Using simple language and explaining the context of those words. So if you are using a trickier word, try to make it that the words around it help you to understand what that word means. That's really useful if someone's using a translation extension, because often they're a bit dodgy and they might not translate things particularly well, but people can kind of gather and understand what you're getting at by the surrounding information. We want to give our content a clear hierarchy and structure. I think a really good example of this is Wikipedia. It's not the most exciting design in the world, but it's got very clear headings. It has very clear contents page, it's very easy to skim a page and find the kinds of things that you want there. We all like to think that everyone visiting our sites is going to pore over every little word we've written. Maybe they'll keep a dictionary next to them so they can look up all the really long and clever words that we're saying. But actually, in real life, people are visiting websites very quickly. They're just trying to quickly find the information they need, get in and get out. And even if they're not doing that, we don't need to take up any more of their time. We need to give our content order. That's how we can create a very clear hierarchy. Ordering information with the most important information first. That's something that journalists are often taught when they're writing news stories, is to do a quick summary at the beginning so people get the gist. Then below that, you go into the story in a bit more depth. And then below that, you go through the whole story again, but with all of the detail that you have, because only the people that want that amount of detail are going to read into the end of the article. So this is another good example from gov.uk. If you're looking up information on preparing for flooding, you probably do want to know the information for if you're about to be flooded first, rather than looking up sort of insurance when you've got water rising outside your front door. Using headings is a really good way to make content clearer. Labeling those longer lengths of text and breaking them up. This is a nice example. There we go. Wire cutter. They've got this is for a review for a bike pump. Not a very exciting thing, but they've got really clear headings so that you can see how they tested, why you should trust them, who is this for, and even a contents at the top of the article so you can easily see what you're expecting to find in the rest of the article, whether it will be any use to you at all. And headings aren't just a visual feature. They can provide landmarks for assistive technology when you use the semantically corresponding HTML. So some of the most basic HTML you'll find, an H1, an H2, and an H3, a heading level 1, heading level 2, heading level 3. By using things like this, people with assistive technology like screen readers can go, okay, I want to jump to between all of the headings. I want to skip the text in between. I'll just jump between the headings to see if I can find what I want. So when you're using a heading like this, rather than using a meaningless div or span element, then people can easily find those things. We have to consider the language we're using when we're writing links. And this is one of my pet peeves. We want it to be very descriptive, because often links are, they're the foundation of the web. And they're often vital calls to action or references to the content that you're writing. And so we want descriptive links where the link actually describes the destination. So, for example, a lot of the time you'll see things like this. To get in contact with our team, click here. You could actually save yourself a lot of text if you just put get in contact with our team and make all of that text into a link. Because the thing is, when someone is skipping through using assistive technology, like a screen reader, if they choose to skip between all of the links, if all of your links say click here, all they're going to hear is click here, click here, click here, click here, 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 here. That's not helpful to anyone. Whereas if your links are skipping between things like get in contact with our team, read our latest articles, and things like that, then that's providing much more valuable information to people. So earlier I said about having alternative forms of content that benefit people who can't access your primary content. It's also pretty good for people who just have preferences for different types of content. You might not like videos, you might prefer reading a transcript instead because you can quickly scroll through and not have to watch someone going like this. One of the simplest ways to provide an alternative is through text for images and video and audio. The most basic example of this is the alternative attribute for images. So you might know this already, but just in case you don't. This is the common element for an image. So you have the source with the file name, and this is the alt tag, as people often call it, but it's the alt text attribute. And what that does is you put in a bit of information there to describe the image, and then assistive technology, if it can't see the image, it will provide the description instead. So it's a fallback. And this is really valuable for people who might be partially sighted, might be using a screen reader, but also for things like email. Email often doesn't load images because it's a good way of tracking people. And so you'll get an imageless version first. And so here's an example of a bit of spam that I got from The Economist. The image at the top is their logo, The Economist, but they provided alternative text for their logo so that when the logo itself doesn't load, you just get the bit of text instead. So it's much more accessible. And so writing meaningful alternative text is really important. I mean, it's just tiny little microcopy, but it could really make a difference. Not just for people using assistive technology, it's also really good for search engines. Because search engines are currently not very good at indexing images, understanding their content, anywhere near as well as they can read the text on the page. So if all you could see is a description saying, photo of my dog, there's not much point to that image. Like, what makes that photo of my dog special? Why did I share that particular photo of my dog? If, however, I put in an alt attribute of my dog lying on the bedroom floor with his whole body visible but his head completely obscured under the bed, you start to get a vaguely better idea of why I've bothered sharing that image. And it's because my dog's an idiot. We don't need to provide alternative text for decorative images. So if we leave the alternative text attribute empty, like that, so you include the quotes, but you don't put anything inside it, then assistive technology knows that's a decorative image, we'll just skip past that. And a good place to hone your craft of this kind of microcopy is on social media, because you actually make your tweets more accessible. If you go, it's kind of hidden in the Twitter settings, but if you go to the accessibility settings that are right at the very bottom of your profile settings, you can turn on compose image descriptions. And this is really cool, because when you go to add an image to a tweet, you have a little option to add a description. And then when you go to add a description, it says, describe this photo for the visually impaired. You get a nice big photo of your image displayed, so you can see what it is while you're describing it. And of course, Mastodon, the friendly and more ethical Twitter alternative, also includes an option to compose an image description. The good thing about Mastodon is it does it by default for everyone. It's not a setting you have to turn on. Transcripts. So I mentioned them briefly earlier, but for video and audio content, transcripts are the best thing you can do, the long-form text. This is This American Life podcast, and they have transcripts for a lot of their podcasts, although they do say on it, transcripts are generated using a combination of speech recognition software and human transcribers and may contain errors. Please check the corresponding audio before quoting in print. So it's not really designed for accessibility. It's not designed for someone who has no choice but to read the text. But it's there. It's better than nothing. And transcripts are really just a form of very juicy text, because they can make the content accessible to people who can't hear the audio. But it's also a useful alternative for people who just want to skim through that content, who just want to find the bit that interests them the most. And there's an added bonus that in transcripts you can include a lot of stuff that you can't include in an everyday bit of audio. So this is back to that freelance.tv. Oh, this is very light, but you can see it actually has the names of the speakers and the times. I mean, I think the names are more important, because how many times have you listened to some audio and there's two people on it that sound really similar and it's really hard to tell who's speaking when? And so that's a really nice solution to it. And it actually makes the transcript more valuable, in a sense. And this is another example from the Freakonomics podcast, where they actually link their content. So they reference everything that they've said. If they're talking about particular articles and things like that, they reference it in the transcript, which is really useful if you're listening to something and you're going, oh, I want to know where they got that from. Why are they saying that? Can they back that up? So you can go and listen inside the transcript. Captions and subtitles are what we really want to use for video content. That's the ideal thing. And so the difference between subtitles and captions, and I always get this muddled up, Subtitles are lines of text that are either transcriptions or translations of the speech on screen. So the stuff that looks like that. Closed captions are similar, but they also include oral information such as sound or music that is not speech, but is relevant to that speech or its context. So I found a very quick example where I saw this bit of saying snapping, and they often put it in square brackets. But it might be something like doorbell rings, because that's in a scene in a film, that would be relevant information. However, something like background noise of a city, not necessarily relevant information, so you might not want to keep that in. And producing captions and subtitles might look like it's really complicated, but it's actually very straightforward. It's time-consuming, but it's pretty easy to do, because there is really good free and open software to do it. So this is an app called Joomla. It's not pretty, but this is where I think I transcribed a talk. And what you end up doing is you just end up typing it in, corresponding it with the timestamps. It's really good because you can run the audio through this app, so you can actually like pause and play it, and it will actually give you the timestamps. So that's really easy to just type it in. There is auto-captioning on things like YouTube, and a lot of people will rely on that, but it's never going to be the same quality as when it's done by someone who actually understands the content and who isn't a robot. So this is an example of a talk I gave a year and a half ago. All the way through, whenever I talk about advertisers, it said appetizers. And kind of changes the meaning of it. So it's not great. I mean, as well as YouTube not being generally wonderful. But I found that in my experience, and I'm a very amateur caption maker, but I'm a reasonably fast typist, it probably takes me about 3 times the length of a video to produce a good transcript. And maybe slightly longer than that to produce good captions because you're timing it to the different timestamps. And captions even are increasingly used in social media because videos keep playing on mute by default. And so you can actually use captions to get people to read things. So this is a news video off a news Twitter feed. So they've got captions so that you can actually understand what's going on. And this is a wonderful advert I got on my Facebook feed. I mean, it's not particularly valuable content, but I know what it is when it's on mute. So I hope I'm starting to convince you that good accessibility is good usability. And I'll come to a little myth that I come across quite often. And it's this idea that accessible websites can't be beautiful or can't be attractive. And I think part of the problem with this is often the websites we go to learn about accessibility aren't particularly attractive in themselves. And so we associate that with, oh, well, maybe all accessibility is just ugly text. But this isn't the case at all, because aesthetics are really a part of usability. Aesthetics, when they're used as design and not just kind of for decoration to distract people. Because the thing is, ugly design is not accessible. When something's distracting, when there's too much on a page, that's not usable. And we're not making art with the products that we're building. Some people might be specifically making art. But generally, we're not making art. We don't need to make things all over the place and exciting just for the sake of it. Because actually, beauty is a thoughtfully designed interface. It's where we make those nice, simple aesthetic decisions that help our interfaces do the job they're designed to do. And so these are some aesthetic principles that I think really help with accessibility and help create functional and beautiful interfaces. And it's particularly important for people with cognitive impairments, people who have different neurodivergent needs, people who might find it difficult to concentrate on a page, people who might find it hard to remember where something usually is on a page, and people who are just new to technology and don't yet understand the conventions that a lot of us use every day. Having interfaces presented to you, what you need to be able to understand is, what is the purpose of this interface? What can I do with it? How do I use it? And what happens when I use it? And one of the ways we can do this is through affordances. we can use affordances to convey this information. So this is an example of things we might be able to press on a page. How do we know which of these things we can actually interact with, and what do we expect to happen when we interact with them? One of my pet peeves is you need to use buttons for buttons and links for links. So when this comes up, you expect it to make something happen. When you see a button, you expect it to execute an action. When you see a link, you expect it to take you somewhere. Interfaces shouldn't be surprising. Sometimes a button will execute an action and take you somewhere else as well, but the nuances between these aren't that different. And if you're creating interfaces where you're mixing up, you're putting buttons everywhere because you think it looks more eye-catching than links, that's going to be really confusing to people who have cognitive difficulties. And conventions in design are there for a reason. They're really valuable because they're easy to understand, and that makes things easy to use. Often, particularly designers, not necessarily people working in development, but designers are very good at wanting to create things that are different just for the sake of being different, just so that they can be new. But when we're designing interfaces, we need to do it without ego. This is an example about navigation. Navigation along the top of a page. That's a great convention. That's why so many websites use it. And because so many websites use a list of links across the top of a page, everyone knows what to expect when they see that. But also, don't just do things because everybody else does it. Like this asterisk to say that something is a required field. Relationships are key in explaining the context in aesthetic design. So if I go back to this example of all of the different things you could interact with, actually if you looked at any two things on this screen, you'd probably understand how to interact with them based on how different they are from the other things you interact with. So at the text at the top, if I saw that interact with me in bold text, just plain like that, next to this interact button, well, I go, well, that's plain text, and that's got a big whacking great green background behind it. So I guess that's text I don't click, and that's something I can click. These relationships really matter. And we can use space to make the content relationships clear as well, and that's what we do in layout. Most important content at the top, header, very conventional place to put all of that heading information, less important stuff at the side, contextual menu, alongside the content. So the kind of Facebook, Twitter, email buttons, that's relevant to the content, so it's placed to the side of it. And that's why it's also important to provide a lot of space around your layouts so that people can distinguish these different areas and these different relationships between those elements. And the screen is infinite. We're very lucky that we're designing for screens and not pieces of paper because we don't have to compete for space. We can give elements as much space as they need. And don't underestimate the power of that single column layout. Because if it works on a mobile device, there's no reason why it shouldn't work on a bigger screen too. It's very important for people who are using keyboard navigation that the layout order reflects the content order. And often people using keyboard navigation switch controls, linear forms of input. People using screen readers will often use keyboard navigation by itself, but often people using keyboard navigation who can see the screen, you want to make sure that what they're doing with their keyboard is reflected on the screen. So, for example, you might have three fields, form fields here, A, B, and C. When you tab through them, you expect the order to be A, B, C. With new content layout, things like Flexbox and or even absolute positioning in CSS and CSS grid, you can now switch the layout around so the content appears out of order. So you could have your boxes like C, A, B without having to change your HTML. The thing is, if you do that and someone's trying to tab through it, they'll end up going like that. So it doesn't reflect the order at all, which can be very confusing, particularly if C is all the way up here and B is all the way down there. I've realised I just walked right out of the shot of the camera. Width, line length, another really simple thing that can make a huge difference to your typography. This is really confusing and difficult to read. There's no space on that far edge, so it makes it very hard to jump from one end of the sentence to the line to the next one. Particularly when it's this wide, you might even end up reading it by going like this, like get whiplash from having to move your head around so much. It's not comfortable. A lot of people like to talk about using a certain amount of characters per line to make it comfortable to read, but I think a lot of it is based on judgment. Things like the height of the font itself, the height of the X height, which is like the height of an O or an X, the space between the lines, that's very important. All of these things will make a difference on how comfortable line lengths can be. And this brings me on to typography. When you want to choose a fun font for your site, choose it on readability first. Suitability to your content second, so if you're creating a cool theme. And because you think it looks cool, never worth it just to look cool. And this is an example of how our choices of fonts could really make a difference to our design. So the Heinemann was actually created specifically for people who had difficulty reading. Because actually the shape of the letter forms are very similar to how when we're first learning to write or read, that's the shapes that we actually hand write. And yet the serifs are on Georgia and things like that, they're a bit fancy, they look really cool, but they are a little bit harder to read because they do have these fancy ornamental things. And so this does make a difference in when you're choosing your fonts to make it as easy to read as possible. Another pet peeve of mine that comes from a lot of designers is the idea that small is really cool. People like to use tiny text because it looks all neat and tidy. So this is a lovely, tiny little bit of text. Doesn't it look like in this expanse of space, it looks so lovely and rectangular in the middle there, really neat. But the thing is, if your text is so small you can't read it, there's no point in it being there in the first place. And we've also got to not prevent font resizing for that reason. So if you do end up having text that's too small for anyone, because people do have different needs, make sure that they can resize it with the browser and you're not doing anything to prevent that. Font weights, also important. Having very thin text like this does not look good on a low resolution screen, but also very fat text is much difficult to read because the spaces inside the text, inside the letters, are much smaller, so they're harder to tell apart from each other. The height, just the space between the lines of the text. So this is 80% of the font size, line height. It's really tight, it's really difficult to read because all of the ascenders and descenders, the bits that are sticking up and sticking down at the bottom of the letter forms, kind of cross over with each other, making it hard to distinguish the letters. But again, if you put too much space between, you end up with that situation again where jumping from the end of one line to the beginning of the next is a really big leap. So this is about 110% of the font size, and I usually prefer somewhere between 110 and 120, but that's me. I like quite roomy stuff like that. Colour. Colour's really valuable. You can make things really beautiful using colour, but you shouldn't use it as a crutch or as a sole means to convey information, particularly if you're trying to show errors in forms. That's the thing where you just change the text to red. Because what happens if someone finds it hard to distinguish between green and red colours, which is actually the most common form of colour blindness, which affects, I think, around 5% of Caucasian people is affected by red-green colour blindness. And so a page like this, and it wouldn't look exactly like this, but it would be the equivalent of like that. So it's actually really hard to distinguish the green from the red when it's in grayscale. A good example of one of the ways that you might use red is if there's a spelling error or something in the text. You know, when you have that in software, that it will tell you if you spelt something wrong, and it has that dotted line underneath. See the difference in just having that slightly, it was more of a dashed line, I guess. Having a dashed line below the text. Now you actually understand what that means. Whereas when it was just red text, what was the difference? That example also shows how important the contrast between colours is, to have a high contrast between your foreground text and your background. This is a particularly good example in a room like this that's brightly lit and where the projector's quite low. It's really hard to see when there's a low contrast between the text and the background. A really great tip I heard from Jerry Cody, who's an illustrator, is to, illustrator and designer, test your designs in grayscale. And this is an example of a site she designed. She did beautiful illustrations for it for Simply Accessible. And you see, it looks equally beautiful in grayscale. It's equally easy to read. You still have room for creativity when you're following these principles. So it's not about whether something's beautiful or not. You can still be very creative within these constraints. It's a nice example of a site I found recently. It's a kind of a job platform. And they really care about accessibility. And yet some of the text is a little bit small. A little bit red is quite a tricky colour to have high contrast against a white background. But generally, that's gorgeous. And a pretty accessible site. I think we've got to the point now where we can distinguish ourselves and what we do. We can distinguish our products, our services, and ourselves based on the fact we actually care about each other. And we care about these things. And it can be quite intimidating, understanding the potential impact of our work and the huge reach that we might have, because most of us, we probably joined the industry because of its potential in things like new shiny technologies, the democratization of information, or just the fact that you could have a huge reach with the things that you do. And so you might find yourself going, didn't really sign up for thinking about all of these different things when I'm just trying to put a page on the internet or on the web. And this is why we really need to be ethical about the things that we design. And this is why me and my partner designed this ethical design manifesto to help us have these kinds of guidelines for ethical technologies. And I'm only going to rush over this very, very quickly, so if anyone wants to talk to me about it later, we can do that. But if you have the core of a product is being decentralized, private, secure, open, interoperable, sustainable, and inclusive, that respects human rights. We're already very good at making the fleshy part of our products, the part that is functional and convenient and reliable, and that's what respects human effort. And in recent years, the delight part has become very important, the kind of the beautiful outside, the bit that makes something intriguing and make people want to use it. And that, we understand, respects human experience. And once we've achieved all of these things together, that gives us ethical design. The thing is, if we don't make our sites inclusive, if we don't respect human rights, even if we do respect these other things, we respect human effort and human experience, we end up building very superficial products. And a rotten core is the sign of a superficial product. It's a misleading product. And you might make it fun and attractive, but that's decoration. When something looks pretty, but it's really no good underneath. And the reason we need to build ethical things and we need to build inclusive things is because we need to build for our future. The point of the products we build is really important. We need to build these for our future selves. We might have different needs in the future. In fact, we almost certainly will, because we're likely mostly going to age. We need to do it for us as individuals and to benefit society as a whole. It's not always illegal to be unethical, to build, especially in the areas of technology where laws and legislation just can't keep up. We've already gone too far in building a lot of unethical technology too. But let's go ahead and try to build it for our own sakes. Let's build it for people that don't have the same needs as us, people who are more vulnerable than us too. And as part of this, I wrote a book called Accessibility for Everyone, and it was published in September. And very, very kindly, the wonderful folks organising this conference have given every one of you a free copy of the book in your goodie bags. And it's the first and only time anyone has done this, and I'm so glad, because I think it's so cool that I get to share it with you. So let's go ahead and make a better web. Thank you.